little while ago, a friend invited me to watch all of the movies in the Jurassic Park and World franchise. And I was a little skeptical at first because I had heard only the first movie was any good. But now that I've seen them all, I can in fact confirm that the first movie is the only good one. But that isn't to say that the rest of them weren't worth watching, because, to me at least, they all triggered my intellectual curiosity. Not because they were well written, but because they are all great examples of what I like to call the sequel problem. You are likely familiar with the sequel problem yourself. A standalone story is released, whether it be a book, a season of a TV show, or a movie, and you enjoy it. It then becomes popular and a sequel is announced, or a continuation of the story, and you get excited. And then it just doesn't hold up. For some reason that you can't quite put your finger on, the sequel isn't as good as the original, or sometimes isn't even good at all. And this is the sequel problem that I want to try to solve today. What makes a sequel to a story work or fail? But in order to do that, we need to be on the same page about what sequels are. There are two main ways we can categorize sequels: into direct sequels or spin-offs, and then into planned versus unplanned sequels. That first division is less important for our purposes today, but still interesting to consider. A direct sequel continues the main plot or theme of the original story, typically with most of the same cast of characters, while a spin-off continues only one small part of the story, typically focusing on one, or at most a small handful, of minor characters from the first work. What is especially interesting is that while we can likely name more direct sequels in modern times than spin-offs, in the past it was almost the opposite. Go on, try to think of a direct sequel older than, say, the 1800s. Even I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. But if you broaden your definition to a sequel to include those spin-offs, the first thing that pops into my mind is ancient Greek tragedies, namely Oedipus Rex, which had several follow-up plays focusing on his children. In fact, what is some other great examples of ancient Greek stories? What is the Iliad, if not a predecessor to the Odyssey, a spin-off of it? And Agamemnon, a side character from both stories, had his own spin-off play. I could go on, but most of these spin-offs have to do with the protagonists being first and foremost mythological characters. And mythology has a very weird sequel status because it exists more as a web of stories than as a single branching story, and as such is a topic for another week. So let's move on to our second division of sequels, planned versus unplanned. See, a sequel being planned in this context doesn't refer necessarily to the amount of forethought an author put into that sequel. Rather, it refers to whether that sequel is a part of a planned overarching story which includes the original work. For instance, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Two Towers is a sequel to The Fellowship of the Ring, but both exist as a part of the greater story of The Lord of the Rings. But The Lord of the Rings was, in itself, a sequel to The Hobbit, a standalone novel Tolkien never planned on writing a sequel for. Now, this division of planned or unplanned is more important to our discussion today because the relationship that a sequel has with its original work and the role it plays in a series impacts how it is written, which in turn impacts the specific ways it can work or fail. That first type of sequel, a planned sequel, is far less unique in the writing department. Typically, these installments are far more cohesive with the rest of the series it is a part of, and so any way they fail is closer to how a normal standalone story can be poorly written, rather than because of its unique position as a sequel. In other words, they're less interesting to analyze as a sequel specifically, and thus I'm going to focus more on that second type, the unplanned sequel. You may recall that in the last episode, I included sequels, spin-offs, and reboots among these types of stories that are functionally the same as remakes. This is because what most unplanned sequels do is that they need to continue a story which has already concluded. So what they do is reset to the status quo and redo the original story all over again. The villain who was defeated has somehow returned. The arcs that were learned must be relearned, and any fancy MacGuffins the characters received will be replaced with even cooler items that are functionally the exact same. We see this time and time again, especially in more modern works. The Jurassic World franchise, for instance, Star Wars The Force Awakens, any number of big action movies today. The main difference between a movie remake doing this and a sequel doing this is in the impact. The worst that happens when you watch a bad movie remake is that you see a less competent version of a better film. But aside from the wasted time, the original movie is still great. When a sequel does this type of hard story reset, however, it can retroactively ruin the original story. If everything the heroes did in the first story, all of their accomplishments, their lessons, the growth, is simply undone or made inconsequential, it undermines all of the accomplishments and growth that we, the audience, were invested in. And while this is the worst case scenario, simply redoing all of the original plot and character beats in a sequel can fail in another way. In the exact way it failed in Jurassic Park, actually. See, there are technically two series in the franchise, Jurassic Park and Jurassic World, and all of them are ostensibly the same movie. And as I already stated, and you likely already know, the original first Jurassic Park film is really the only well-written one. But why? Well, in my mind, it had to do with the levels of depth. See, there were several layers and elements in the original movie. The empty theme park as a setting, all the different dynamics between the characters, and the different plot threads that we would weave in and out. Yet with each subsequent movie in the franchise, specifically the Jurassic Park franchise, it would lose elements of the story, becoming simpler and simpler until there was very little left beyond that base premise of dinosaurs running around and eating people. Then the Jurassic World movie reset the story to essentially a soft reboot of that first Jurassic Park movie. And with each subsequent installment in that franchise, more and more elements would be added. For instance, a character would be introduced in the first movie and fulfill a small niche in the story. That niche then wouldn't exist in the next installment, and rather than removing that character, they would simply add another one to fill a new niche, rinse and repeat with each subsequent movie. So while there were more elements in the story, very few of them served a purpose. So what is the solution to the sequel problem? What makes for a good sequel, specifically a good unplanned sequel? Well, as you can probably already guess, it's very similar to what makes for a good remake. Changes must be made. But the changes a remake makes typically have to do with the changes of the presentation or the content surrounding the story's core identity. A sequel, however, will often need to make a change to that story's core identity in order to add something new to the series as a whole and move the story forward. This is a lot less drastic in practice than it sounds in theory. For instance, one of the best examples of a story doing this all well is the Terminator franchise. The first Terminator film is ostensibly a psychological horror, while the second is a big shoot-'em-up action movie. In order for the characters and the world to move forward, they had to do something totally new, not just the same thing in a different way. Another example that I personally find fascinating is Brandon Sanderson's The Reckoners trilogy. From what I can glean just by reading the books, the first novel was supposed to be standalone, or Sanderson at least hadn't fully thought out the next two parts of the series, because at its core, the theme of the first book is simple. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in the next two books, in order to move the story forward, Sanderson tweaked this core theme. Rather than all power corrupting, he made the powers almost an allegory for sin. Power itself isn't corrupting, but there's another outside corrupting influence on the power that, once removed, lets free will and choice take over. It's a little confusing, and while I don't think the new theme is as strong as the original theme, it was necessary in order to continue the story. And in that way, it works very well, which I think brings us all back around to what the purpose of a sequel is: to continue the story and characters from an original work. A sequel can do this by focusing in on the specific aspects or characters which have lots of future potential, such as through a spin-off. But if the author wants to continue a story directly, they need to add to it rather than simply reiterating it. Hello, my name is Daphne Pulsone. Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Writing Referendum. All of the stories I mentioned today can be found at the Weston Public Library for your viewing convenience, and I'd love to hear what you thought about it. Tell me any other sequels I should have mentioned, whether you thought I was right about all of the writing theory or whether you thought I was wrong, and anything else that you think is interesting about sequels and remakes.